welcome back to the 2022 National C. diff Advocate Summit from the Peggy Lillis Foundation. I'm Christian John Lillis, Executive Director and co-founder. And I increasingly say Peggy's eldest son, so we keep that connection going. So I'm very excited about this next topic, so excited that I inserted myself into it. I almost went into access, almost. Kevin was like, no, Christian, you can't. But I was like, so what we're going to talk about tonight now is clinical practice guidelines. So we talked earlier about access and the FDA and passing laws and all this stuff. But a lot of what drives clinical practice, and if you were here for Debbie's Goff's conversation, is clinical society guidelines. Like that's kind of how doctors and other clinicians keep up to date on what the newer treatments are, how things work. And so, and for infectious diseases, especially ones that don't have a huge sort of patient movement around them, we're often not included. I want to introduce our two speakers, and they're each going to present a bit, and then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and then of course we'll take questions from all of you. Following this session, we're going to have another breakout session. We're going to have in this room, we're going to have a conversation about microbiota and microbiome restoration with Ken Blount from Rebiotics. And in the other room, we're going to have a session on novel antibiotic treatment for primary and recurrent C. diff with Katie Johnson from Crestone. So to be very similar to that. And then after that, back here, we will be having a conversation about the importance of C. diff toxin testing with David Lyerly from Tech Lab. I got that right. And then I'll be back here to, say a few words or something. But anyways, let me introduce our panelists. I haven't written it yet. So Malavika Tampi was born in southern India, immigrated to the US in 1995 and was raised in central Ohio. She went to Ohio State University where she received her bachelor's degree in food science, and then the University of Michigan where she received her master's in public health in 2013. Master's in public health. In 2013, she moved to Chicago where she began her career at the American Dental Association Center for Evidence-Based Dentistry, where she worked for 8 years, developing clinical practice guidelines for dentists and their teams. Since 2020, she has been adjunct faculty at the University of Michigan School of Dentistry. And in 2021, she left the ADA to join the Infectious Disease Society of America, where she continues to develop clinical policies for ID doctors as a guideline methodologist. As a PLF Scientific Advisory Council member, Malavika is with us today to share different methods for including patients in the development of clinical practice guidelines. So thank you, Mal, for being here. Also the first time we've met in person because of the pandemic. It's lovely to see you. And Dr. Tim Dawson. Tim is the co-founder of The Art of Democracy, who works in collaboration with artists, academics, public officials, and residents of diverse communities to design civic engagement strategies that practically give life to the principles of deliberative democracy and human-centered design. Tim is particularly interested in creating new opportunities for democratic engagement among diverse stakeholders within institutionalized or traditional decision-making processes. Currently, Tim works on 2 research teams employing deliberative engagement to address challenges on either end of the clinical practice guideline process, patient and public engagement, patient and public engagement in CPG development and CPG uptake by healthcare providers. I see where you were going with that sentence now, Tim. I have a minor in poetry writing. I think I would understand grammar better. Tim earned a PhD from Carnegie Mellon's University's rhetoric program, where his research focused on developing creative strategies that help people engage their differences as a resource for cynic innovation. So first up, I think we're going to have Mal, and then Tim, and then we're going to have a chat. So take it away, Mal.
Christian. Okay, so hi everyone, and I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you, but please do come say hi if you haven't talked to me yet. I'd love to meet you. My name is Malavika, and I'm again very excited to be invited here by Christian and the PLF team. I live in Columbus, Ohio at the moment with my parents. I've been hiding in their basement since COVID pretty much. So I have the luxury now of working remotely with IDSA. And so I'm moving to Arizona. So that's where I'll be soon. And my organization is here in Washington, D.C., though. So I'm all over the place. I was in Chicago, like Christian said, for a little bit. So it's really nice to be able to interact since I'm remote now with so many people from across the country. And I just wanted to mention that remote work is great, gives you a lot of opportunities, but it's amazing to be here in person. So I'm going to be talking today about patients and clinical practice guidelines and how those two things come together. It sounds obvious, but it's a little bit more intentional than it has to be a little bit more intentional than it really is in reality. So I have a few disclosures to share with all of you. First, I'm here as a PLF council member, though I am employed elsewhere with IDSA, and I was with the American Dental Association as well. That was mentioned before. I'm a council member at the Guidelines International Network, and I work with the Low and Middle Income Countries Working Group, and I'm also a member of the GRADE Working Group. So the objectives for my presentation today are to discuss what guidelines are. So they're called evidence-based clinical practice guidelines. They're referred to as CPGs from here on out in the presentation. I'll be talking about who uses them and why they're important. And after that, I'll be going into why they're developed and who develops them, what methodology is used, how stakeholders and patients are engaged in the process, and then how recommendations, which are ultimately the major deliverable of a guideline, are formulated. So the Institutes of Medicine define clinical practice guidelines as statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care, and they should be informed using a systematic review of the best available evidence. And systematic reviews gather information on the benefits and harms of the various treatment options that are being considered to be recommended for or against. So based on that, guidelines have two parts: the foundation, which is the systematic review, and then the set of recommendations, which includes that evidence in the decision-making process by a panel of experts, which includes clinical or subject matter experts. Target users include clinicians, policymakers, and patients. So why are guidelines important? They help reduce unnecessary or inappropriate variation in clinical practice. As Dr. Goff was saying earlier, if you go between private dentistry versus dental clinics where there's a lot of standardization because it's run by a management team, it's not a private practice setting, there is going to be differences in how those dentists practice. And so guidelines could help standardize those practice decisions if used appropriately. Guidelines can also inform a variety of tools, resources for clinical decision-making. There's a lot more guideline recommendations being used in EHRs as well as clinical decision support systems. So they really are making their way very slowly into tools that are used chairside by clinicians. Guidelines provide opportunities for collaboration, formalized opportunities for collaboration at an organizational level, and guidelines are supposed to include patients' values and preferences in the evidence decision process. So that is actually a key piece of information a guideline panel should be using to inform their recommendations. So who develops guidelines and how do they do it? Usually, organizations that represent doctors, dentists, etc., are the ones who should be developing guidelines because they actually have the influence and the resources to develop them. Guidelines are an incredibly expensive endeavor. You wouldn't think so, but they are. First of all, you need to have a team who's able to understand the evidence, make sense of it, put it into a format that is easily discussable by a panel of clinicians and other subject matter experts. And then you have to facilitate them, facilitate the conversation so that they can make those decisions. And that takes team, that takes resources, that takes a lot of scientific articles, which are not cheap. You have to buy them from libraries. It's a whole thing. So it's usually done by organizations that have resources, which obviously is a limiting factor in many parts of the world. So it's not great. Departments and ministries of health across the world also develop guidelines, as do health systems. Guideline panels are then put together by these organizations to develop the guidelines. And so these include people who are experts in the field. This could include clinicians who treat the patient populations that the guidelines are on, or just collaborative clinicians. For example, if we're doing a guideline on I was with the ADA, so we did a guideline on antibiotic use for dental pain and swelling. And so we made sure to include ED physicians on our panel because they also see patients coming in the middle of the night with a toothache. So we wanted to make sure that they're on the panel as well, even though this guideline is ultimately intended for dentists. That also ties into stakeholder engagement, which includes the ADA collaborating with the American College of Emergency Physicians as part of that effort. So by including different stakeholders or people who have a key interest in the outcome of the guideline products, you actually increase buy-in from the start into the recommendations. So ultimately, the people you want to be using your recommendations are part of that process from start to finish. Patient partners specifically are historically not included in guideline development. And that's what I wanted to come here today to talk with all of you about and to hear your perspectives on this. Guidelines usually use patient values and preferences as the way to get information about what patients value in their treatment decisions, but it's difficult for a variety of reasons that we can't really get into too much depth today. But there are opportunities now that are opening up for people to have a voice in the guideline development process, and so we wanted to explore a little bit what that would look like. And when we're formulating a guideline panel, if a patient is not allowed to be a part of the panel, there are also other alternatives to that. And when convening guideline panels, one of the major things that you all should know should be part of any guideline that you are using or aware of, you should check if they have the panel members included in the process have their conflicts of interest disclosed and managed throughout the process, because that's an integral part of a trustworthy guideline. And that's also in the IOM criteria. And finally, when building a team, the guideline methodologist or someone like me is also very important to the process, because I actually can help the process run smoothly from beginning to end. And I can make sure that the panel and the whole process stay as unconflicted as possible, because at the end, the clinicians and patients using the guidelines should feel trust in those recommendations. And that's ultimately what's most important. Clinical questions are, what you see on the right is a figure that describes the process at a very high level from start to finish. The guideline panel formulates clinical questions. A systematic review is conducted based on those questions. So they're gathering all of the evidence out there from randomized controlled trials, observational studies on that clinical topic, synthesizing that evidence into estimates that can be used by the panel to make decisions. And then I would present that data to the panel to then help them formulate those recommendations. This is the overall process that you see on the screen right now. I won't get into it. It's very, very complicated. Obviously, there were a lot of animations associated with it. I took it all out for obvious reasons. But what you see is the general framework for guideline development. And just to look at the top part, that's the systematic review process only. Once the systematic review is done, then the guideline recommendations get formulated. So from the left to the right, the clinical questions are developed. The outcomes of importance to patients are determined. So for example, there are outcomes that are important to patients called patient important outcomes, and then outcomes that are less important to patients. And those are usually called surrogate outcomes. And so when guideline panels are making decisions, it's very, very important that they're making decisions based on outcomes that are important to patients. Otherwise, it's very difficult to be able to communicate to patients or even amongst clinicians about why we're pursuing a specific treatment option. So one thing that also, when you're looking at a guideline, make sure you take a look at the clinical questions and see if the outcomes that the questions that they're asking and the recommendations are answering these questions, that they're all based on outcomes that are important to you. So for example, with C. diff, it's not necessarily how much of bacteria, let's say, is in the body as a surrogate outcome. It's did you get sick or not? So the morbidity would be the patient important outcome. Having some bacteria in your blood, or I don't know the exact clinical terms that would be used in this context, but having some measure of the amount of bacteria would not be the outcome that's important to the patient. It's whether they get sick or not, or die or not. So that's how we define outcomes to then make decisions. We go through the studies. Like I said, we put it into nice tables, and then we formulate recommendations based on a variety of factors. And the methodology that we use is called GRADE. It's highly tested, validated methodology that's used worldwide to develop guidelines and systematic reviews. For systematic reviews, what it helps us do is assess the certainty of the evidence that we're using to inform our decisions or recommendations. And then when it comes to the guideline part of the process, the grade methodology helps us move from evidence to decision, using the certainty of the evidence to inform how strong or weak our recommendations are. Strong recommendations are informed by high or moderate quality evidence. Low or very low certainty evidence and usually is related to weak or conditional recommendations. So how does patient engagement influence recommendations? So as I mentioned before, we have the systematic review component, which is going to inform the balance between benefits and harms piece of the guideline development framework. There are a host of other things that guideline developers have to consider before formulating recommendations. And this includes values and preferences of patients, resources, acceptability, feasibility, and equity. And of course, we are here today because we want to talk about how patients are included. And as I mentioned before, this is something that's really just starting as a major conversation at the association organizational level. And I hope that you won't be discouraged, but that this is actually hopeful that this is only going to get more and more important to an organization to include these what we call PVPs in the guideline development process. So why should stakeholders, including patients, be engaged? This is an example from the 2019 ADA guideline on antibiotic use for dental pain. When a patient comes in for a toothache, let's say to the dentist, they're going to either be referred for further treatment at an endodontist, or they're going to be prescribed an antibiotic, the appropriate antibiotic that the dentist thinks should be given. But let's say they go to the ED physician in the ER, they might have either their tooth pulled, given a whole bunch of antibiotics they shouldn't receive, or they just leave the ED. They're never referred for treatment. So this is going back to the example I gave before, engaging the right professionals within the guideline development panel or as stakeholders, even if they're not on the panel, as stakeholders in the process, actually facilitates communication between providers that actually are, in essence, treating these same patients or having to deal with these same patients for the same conditions. Also, it's important to include patients because, for example, this patient, it's important to know that he is afraid of going to the dentist. He may just avoid the dentist, just every single time because he hates going there. So how do we find this patient? How do we help this patient? And we can't do that if we don't know that this is what patients are doing or feeling. So this is also part of why patient engagement is important to the guideline development process. This is an example from an actual guideline that happened in one country versus another on mammography for breast cancer screening. And what these two panels found is that one group of guideline developers in one country presented the same evidence as another group in another country, and they found that one country prioritized the beneficial outcomes of screening over the costs associated with it and other quote unquote harms or resource harms associated with it. Therefore, they wanted to provide everyone a mammography screening. Versus the other country, they were like, is a high probability for false positives. We don't think it's worth everyone getting this, and the resources are too high. We would be okay if only a small proportion of the population was recommended for screening. So the values and preferences of these two groups was different, and using the same scientific evidence, they formulated vastly different recommendations. But that was perfectly okay because the values and preferences in these two groups of people were different. So ultimately, they weren't doing harm, and one group wasn't right versus the other is what I'm trying to say. And ultimately, this is how using patient values and preferences should work in guideline development. I won't get into this too much because I'm sure there will be questions at the end, and Tim will be talking more in depth about patient engagement and how that actually looks. But there are several points in the guideline development process where patients are or could be engaged. One is when the topic is being selected, the panel is being put together, and the clinical questions are being asked. It would be very, very helpful to have a patient on the panel, or if not an appropriate use of a patient's time, patient advocacy organizations being involved in the stakeholder engagement process. There's also opportunities during the evidence synthesis process for systematic review of patient values and preferences on that particular topic to be completed and included in the evidence decision framework. There can be focus groups with patients that are conducted before the panel meeting to formulate recommendations, that information being taken to the panel, and they talk through that information. There could be public comment period, which again, Tim will kind of differentiate those two things, but the public comment period is a call for anyone, any of you for any guideline would be able to submit your feedback on a particular organization's recommendations if they post them online and say, we want to hear from you. But that's going to be a little bit different than having a focus group of patients who've dealt with the issue at hand and want to actually provide their personal anecdotes and experiences. So I just wanted to differentiate between those two things, but they're both useful. And then I wanted to note that recommendations that you see in most guidelines are geared towards the average patient. They're not going to get into all of the different types of patients which exist out there. And so when you're looking at a guideline, don't feel disheartened that maybe you are not included in there. It's worth asking about, and it's also worth asking your clinician about. I mean, if there is a patient group that an advocate is representing and you're not seeing them in an organization's guidelines and you think they should be, it's worth asking, why aren't we included here? Also, there are recommendations, but then if you look under recommendations, sometimes there's a big box of, but if this doesn't apply to you, this is what you do. So I would also suggest looking there. It's not a great, it's not great, but that's just where we are at the moment. Also, conditional and weak recommendations versus strong recommendations. So you'll see on here 2 recommendations from the 2019 ADA guideline on antibiotic use for dental pain and swelling. You'll see that the certainty of the evidence for both of these recommendations was very low. One was conditional, one was strong. I'm not going to get into all of the details why one is conditional and one is strong, but what ultimately happens is that the balance favors the benefits in one or the harms in one, so much so that you're able to strongly provide a recommendation that this is what you should do, versus when you're providing conditional recommendations, what that usually means is there's uncertainty about how to proceed. And one way that a recommendation could be conditional is when there's variability in patient values and preferences. So if an organization or a panel know that a lot of different patients would have a lot of different perspectives in how they would want that course of treatment to go, there's going to be a need to provide a conditional recommendation, because that clinician now should be talking to those patients, every single patient, to make sure that they understand how what they would prefer in terms of their treatment plan. So make sure you understand it, whatever your advocacy constituents look like, make sure you understand for the guidelines that are associated with them, what type of recommendations there are. And if there is room to talk with the people, the guideline developers at these various organizations, about strong versus conditional or weak recommendations, so that they can be framed appropriately for use in clinical practice. Otherwise, if everything is a strong recommendation, it's not creating room for clinicians to say, hey, people may want different things with this recommendation. They're just going to do it all the time. And I'm going to skip over this. And I just wanted to note that usually when an organization provides publications, they have a systematic review and a guideline. You should look out for that with any guidance, because it has to be based on the evidence, and the only evidence that should be used when developing clinical practice guidelines is a systematic review. Also, there are a variety of other deliverables that can be used or disseminated after a guideline is published. Some include for the patient pages, so take a look at websites, see if they have those available. There's other sorts of informational documents that organizations will put out. The one in the middle is about penicillin allergies. I think about 1% of the population actually has a penicillin allergy, but I think 10% claim they do. So there's all sorts of educational materials that come out of guideline development as well for patients to be aware of, and as well as for clinicians. And then there's algorithms for decision making that kind of bring together a million recommendations into one nice clinical pathway. And you might see these at your doctor's offices too. Or if you are a clinician, these are super helpful. So that's all I have. I will turn this to Tim.
So yes, my name is Tim Dawson. I am from the Art of Democracy. It's a civic engagement consultancy that I founded based on work that I did earning my PhD at the Carnegie Mellon University, which mentioned that my work focuses on devising strategies for civic engagement that enable people to engage their differences as a resource for civic innovation. I'd like you to, if you remember nothing else that I say today, I'd just like you to remember that phrase, engaging difference as a resource, and use that as a goal. So I too have some disclosures. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose, but I do have to disclose that portions of what I'm presenting today are derived from some CPG processes that were funded by the Food and Drug Administration, as well as conclusions that were shared and helped develop with the American Dental Association. At this point, I will also disclose that nothing on there says that I have a healthcare background or a oral healthcare background, because I do not. I am not. I'm a civic engagement consultant. I am not a health consultant. So I am learning a lot today, and I thank you all for that. And I hope, because I don't know what I'm talking about in some areas, I hope you have a lot of good questions for me so that I can learn even more. All right, so here's what I've learned over the last few years as I have been working on 2 research teams that are working on different aspects of oral health clinical practice guidelines. One of the things is the findings that they use to support the work of patients being involved in clinical practice guidelines are that patients are more likely to accept, implement, and adhere to recommendations that align with patients' values and preferences. That is, if the guidelines as presented to patients reflect their values and preferences, they're more likely to take them on and make use of them, and that use will adhere over time. As the clinical practice guidelines we can trust, which was put out by the National Academy of Medicine in 2011, it recommends that patient and public involvement is a critical component of the CPG development process. In 2017, however, a study found that that wasn't really happening, that recommendation for developing clinical practice guidelines for the inclusion of patients in clinical practice guideline development was not being followed, right? Also in 2020, just specifically within dentistry, few clinical practice guidelines have considered patient values and preferences in the development process. And in the particular guideline we were developing, no patient values and preferences had been included in the acute dental pain guidelines that were being currently published. Right. Now today, after I'm done talking, I hope we can continue conversation about future directions. My background is in civic engagement. There's an entire network around the nation and actually around the world of people that focus on civic engagement and providing opportunities for citizens to become engaged in policymaking processes. I believe that is a resource that can be leveraged along with patient advocacy groups to include citizens in policymaking processes that they are not currently included in, such as the clinical practice guidelines that we're talking about today. So I would love to talk more about that later. Studies have been done to identify when patients have been involved, what they have contributed to the process of CPG development. So these include, they help set patient-centered scope of relevant topics, outcomes, and research. And so when Mal was talking about those questions that drive the systematic reviews, they're called, correct me if I'm wrong here, PICO questions. So it's patients, interventions, comparatives, and outcomes. Thank you. And so including patients in the process at various points in the process helps to shape those PICO questions that end up shaping the systematic review, right? Patients also have a role to play in helping to facilitate this guideline dissemination and implementation. They provide, if they're engaged in a productive way, patients can provide language that can be used on chairside guides for introducing practice guidelines to patients when they're involved in shared decision-making, right? What I'd like to move to now is just how some ways in which we have worked, or I have worked in these research teams to include patients, and that's going to require me to talk a little bit about deliberative engagement. Now, deliberative engagement is characterized by 3 elements. Prior to deliberating, those who are going to be involved receive information about an issue. That information has been crafted by experts and written in an accessible manner. Participants engage in facilitated discussions. They have trained facilitators that help them work with a diverse small group. The goal of this engagement overall is for folks to develop informed opinions. We're not asking people to come to some consensus about anything in particular. We're asking them to develop an informed opinion. So they receive balanced information about issues. They're facilitated in sharing their views. They're facilitated in learning the opinions of others. And importantly, as a group, they collaborate to consider possible consequences of actions that or decisions they might make, right? And I'm going to say a little bit more about that engaging difference as a resource in a moment too. Participants also understand when they get involved in these policymaking processes how their information will be used. So for example, when we're talking about the work that I've done, engaging citizens, patients as citizens in a clinical practice guideline process, they understood that they were not being asked to make the guideline. They were being asked to inform the guideline. They were also understood that what they shared in the final surveys that they ultimately took after their conversations was going to be crafted into a document called a patient values and preferences statement. That statement would then be shared with them. They were able to correct it if it needed to be corrected. They completed another survey that validated the statement, and then that statement was shared with the people who were the guideline development panel, who used that information as they helped shape the recommendations. So this is always important whenever you're doing any civic engagement, is to not fool people into thinking that they're doing something that they're not doing, right? If you invite, so some of the work I've done, for example, with the city of Pittsburgh, helping them do capital budgeting, involving citizens in the capital budgeting process, no, there was never any illusion that the citizens actually were spending actual real money. What they were helping to shape is the types of principles that went into the capital budget. And just being clear about that from the outset helps shape everybody's expectations for what ultimately happens as a result. So I'm just sharing this because I love Iris Marion Young's work, and I think everybody should know about it. I got the idea of engaging difference as a resource from her. This is nothing that will be unfamiliar to any of you, especially based on what I've been hearing everyone talk about, the importance of the stories of patients, right? That people's background, people's experiences, and their interactions within, among, and across many social groups gives them a particular wisdom. What I'd like to emphasize here is that's not just only true of patients, that's also true of practitioners. That is, when we think about engaging difference as a resource, your learning, your background, your experience is a type of particular wisdom. It is not the only thing that can be said about this topic, but it is a valuable thing that can be said about the topic, and it's one body of evidence that we would want to rely on when we're reaching out to understand what would be the best policy to shape in any particular arena. But in order to get that out of people and elicit that type of particular wisdom, you need to provide people the opportunity to share in ways that they are comfortable with. Often this time does have to do with stories of personal experience, creating environments where people feel comfortable that their stories are being listened to, that they're being heard, that they're being taken up and understood, and that other people, if not agreeing with them, or at least understanding what they have to say, right? Also providing an opportunity to help them come to understand their own personal experience, oftentimes in ways that they themselves had not made sense of because they hadn't articulated it. They felt it, they thought it, but they never actually had to articulate it to somebody who had no idea about their experience, right? And that in itself is an educational thing for the individual, right? And so we think about the benefits of engaging differences of resources, people coming to understand new and alternative perspectives. That's oftentimes something that's emphasized, but just as important is that people reach their understanding of their own perspective, and it helps them become better advocates possibly over time for their own needs, right? But overall, my strongest interest is that the group involved develops what Iris Young calls enlarged thought and an expanded collective wisdom, so that when I do share my views in the surveys at the end, I'm not just thinking like I did before I walked into this room, whether it's a virtual room or whether we actually stood face to face and had this conversation. But I now have your thoughts, and I've made them mine through our conversations. And we are now able to have this expanded collective wisdom that's a public resource for everyone, right? And then the process also hopefully fosters civility and also civic connectivity, especially in the work that we've done with municipal governments, bringing neighborhoods together that never really talk to one another and think of themselves as competing for resources. When you actually bring people from those neighborhoods together, they begin to see how they could be sharing resources better. Now, what does that actually look like in practice in the clinical practice guideline? This is actually a figure that is from a forthcoming publication related to the process that we use to develop the acute dental pain guidelines. So there's 3 agents in this graph. There's the clinical practice guideline developers. That's the panel that Mal was talking about a little earlier. There's my team, the Patient Values and Preferences Engagement team. I'm a member of the research team, but then I have the people that I work with, the facilitators that I work with, who we hire to come on board and help moderate things. And then the patients themselves, right? And this is how they interacted. So the clinical practice guideline development team came up with the PICO questions that was driving a systematic review that was being done by some colleagues at McMaster's University in Canada. While they were doing their systematic review, we were doing a national recruitment of patients to be involved in a online deliberative engagement. We ultimately ended up with 100 people signed up, 64 people ended up meeting the criteria of having experienced dental pain in the ways that were of interest to the guideline. Ultimately, we had a lot of attrition after that point, and we ultimately engaged on the day of engagement, which was June 15th of 2021. We had 2 90-minute sessions. Each session contained 4 small groups. Each small group consisted of 8 people and a moderator. They engaged for 90 minutes and then completed a survey. After they completed those surveys, we took the chat transcripts from the online engagement. It was all done were people typing in chat. There was no visual or verbal communication. It was all done through chat. We took those transcripts, and then we took the survey results. We crafted a patient values and preferences statement out of those, and then we shared that back with the participants. They then validated that this does express both. These express the patient values and preferences statement expressed the range of views that were shared in my small group. The patient values and preferences adequately reflects my views, was the 2 questions they had to answer after reviewing the statement. That statement was then, after having been validated by the participants, was then shared with the Clinical Practice Guideline Committee, or the developers. So that's one way of including patients. Right, and I was led to believe by the folks who brought me on board to the research team that it was a novel way of including patients. What I was led to believe was that oftentimes patients' views are expressed through the mouth of the clinicians on the panel. That is, no patient is ever asked anything that the panelist, who is a clinician, now I'm just imagining things that may have happened that may never have happened. So I don't want to, but anyway, the clinician would say, well, my patients feel X, Y, and Z about this. And that becomes the patient values and preferences information that people use to shape the guidelines. And so this was actually involving actual patients in it, and not just involving them in terms of calling them up at 6 p.m. and saying, hey, what do you think about? But instead involving them in a 90-minute engagement with a diverse group of people, all of whom had experienced dental pain, but all of whom also came from different experiences of that dental pain, as well as different backgrounds, possibly based on their geography. It was a national sample. Some of it, based on their economics, based on their gender, based on their ethnicities. So. This is, I think, a clearer expression of what we just looked at, but since I just walked through that whole thing, I'm not going to go into it. And then these slides, I hope, will be available to anyone, and those are all the references that you could reference if you were interested in learning more about what fueled the work that we did. And with that, I'll stop talking.